Imagine for a moment that you've been accused of a terrible crime, a crime you didn't commit, but you have no alibi and no defense. Well, that's what happened to the man in our next story, and he ended up on death row, the last place on earth you'd expect to find a miracle. In 1985, Greg Wilhoit received a phone call that would turn his world upside down.
And it was one of my best friends, and he says, Greg, I don't know how to tell you this, but Kathy's been murdered.
Kathy was Greg's estranged wife and the mother of his 2 young daughters. The couple had been separated for 3 weeks. Both children were in her custody at the time of the murder.
And I just immediately drove over to my mom's house.
He came running into the house, you know, what's happened to my wife and where are my babies? We tried to calm him down, but he was just almost hysterical.
Greg's next stop was the police station.
All right, Greg, tell us again, what were you doing those 3 nights?
Well, Friday night, I was home by myself.
But what he thought would be a routine statement suddenly placed him at the top of their suspect list.
I really can't come up with an alibi.
My wife was murdered in the middle of the night, and when you live by yourself, it's hard to come up with an alibi.
I think the police suspected Greg because the husband is always the first suspect when they're a couple separated.
No visitors or anything during the day Saturday?
No, no visitors.
The police never came up with a motive for me to murder my wife, but they locked into me from day one, and they never, ever looked at anyone else.
You'll find out later.
Greg was arrested and charged with the cold-blooded murder of his wife. The state's case hinged on one crucial piece of evidence, a bite mark found on the victim's body.
It turns out that this bite mark was the only evidence purported to place me at the scene of the crime. All the other physical evidence, hairs, fingerprints, matched neither me or my wife. I just could not believe that people really believed that I would do something like that. And I did not believe that they had any evidence which would indicate that I did, because I knew in my own mind that I had absolutely nothing to do with it.
But it wasn't the evidence that would ultimately convict Greg Wilhoit. It was the lack of defense presented by the attorney his parents had hired for him.
My wife worked for some attorneys, and they told her that he was one of the finest attorneys in the state. And he had been at one time, but that time had passed.
When it came time for Greg's attorney to present his case, he failed to call a single defense witness, including a forensics expert who could prove that the bite mark on Kathy's body was not Greg Wilhoit's.
The whole thing lasted about 9 days. I felt in my heart that he didn't have a chance.
The verdict arrived after only 2 hours of deliberation.
In the case of the state of Oklahoma versus Gregory Wilhoit on the charges of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
I was devastated. It was just too crazy for me to comprehend. It just would not compute.
Well, we were just numb. We were just helpless to do anything for him.
But I did not contemplate, and I did not ever think about him being put to death.
Next came the penalty phase.
They weren't gone but about an hour before they came back with the punishment of death.
And I was just still in a state of utter disbelief. I mean, this was not happening to me. It was like an out-of-body experience, and I was watching it happen to someone else.
Greg was transferred to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister to await execution.
I was ushered through death row, and sure enough, sticking out of every cell was a hand with a mirror on it, checking me out as I'm walking down the hall. I've never been more scared in my life. And wouldn't you know it, they put me in cell 13 on death row. It was like something out of a nightmare. I could not comprehend this was me going to death row for murder. It just wouldn't sink in. No matter how hard I tried to make it, it just wouldn't sit in.
Your time.
No, I'm going to pass today, man.
Sure?
Yeah, I don't want to go out the door.
Okay, it's nice up there.
Nah, heck with it.
Okay.
The first 6 months I was there, I just kept to myself because I didn't really care to interact with my fellow death row inmates.
But the arrival of a new inmate would bring Greg out of his shell. Like Greg Wilhoit, Ron Williamson had been sent to death row for the murder of a young woman.
He'd been there for about a month or so, and we just started visiting one day.
You going out the yard today?
Well, yeah, I'll be out there.
You gotta have somebody if you're on death row. I don't see how anybody could make it emotionally by themselves. Just having one friend made all the difference in the world.
She's doing the boogie woogie.
We developed a friendship slowly over the years until we were like brothers.
Just about the break of day.
You gotta have somebody if you're on death row, and Ron was my friend because you just can't make it by yourself.
Over the next 5 years, Greg and Ron's friendship grew, not just because of their shared interests, but because each firmly believed that the other was innocent.
Everybody was innocent on death row. All you gotta do is ask anybody, they'll be happy to tell you. But Ronnie, by this time, had made a believer out of me, and I'm a hard sell when it comes to innocence of people.
What little bit I've been able to get out of it, I'd say you got a good case for appeal.
I read his entire trial transcript, and the whole time I was there, Ronnie was the only person that actually convinced me that he didn't do it. It's really, really vital to have somebody that believes in you. I mean, that makes all the difference in the world. And I believed in Ronnie, and Ronnie believed in me. And that held us in good stead for, these many years, basically.
Because death penalty verdicts are afforded an automatic appeal, Greg's case was assigned to public defender Mark Barrett.
I really felt that Greg was innocent, partly from the way he talked to me about the case.
Just check it out for yourself. That's all I beg you.
But there's one incident in particular that absolutely convinced me. I said to Greg, "Are you sure that there is no way this bite mark evidence could implicate you if it's done properly by an honest expert?" He said, "No, there's absolutely no way that could hurt me." He did not hesitate for even half a second when he said that to me.
Certain of Greg's innocence, Mark began assembling the experts and evidence to prove it.
We did get access to the bite mark evidence and were able to do testing which showed clearly that Greg could not have been the person who inflicted the bite mark on Greg's wife at the time of her death.
The bottom teeth, you can see here and here, of Greg Wilhoit.
My attorney asked the judge for a motion of directed verdict of innocence, which means that the prosecution did not meet their burden of proof.
The bite mark.
We came back from lunch. The judge says, the defense request is granted. Mr. Wilhoit, you're free to go home. This case is over. It was just such an emotional, uplifting moment. I felt like I was soaring almost. It was just like an emotional burden that I've been carrying around for like 10 years was just lifted, just like that. I felt really great for myself, but I just felt horrible for Ron because he was going to be on death row, and I didn't know for how long, or he may even be executed. I felt just horrible, really.
The dramatic conclusion when It's a Miracle continues. With his close friend Greg Wilhoit, now a free man, Ron Williamson was alone and desperate for someone to believe that he too was innocent. His sister, Annette Hudson, was a frequent visitor.
Every time I would go visit him, he would say, "Annette, you know I didn't do this. Get me out of here." I have known Ronnie all of his life. I can tell when he's lying. He would say, "Annette, I did not kill that girl. I didn't even know that girl. I've never laid eyes on her." I knew that he was innocent.
Ron's death row nightmare continued for another 7 years until finally his time ran out.
I will never forget the day that I got the letter. I went to the mailbox and saw that I had a letter from the warden of the penitentiary of the state of Oklahoma. "Dear Mrs. Hudson, it is with empathy that I must inform you that your brother, Ronald Keith Williamson, is scheduled to be executed at midnight on the 18th of July. It had already been almost 12 years, and I had 5 days to make arrangements to have his body picked up by the funeral home. I had 5 days to choose who I wanted to view the execution. I knew that there wasn't anything I could do except pray for a miracle.
Annette's miracle came when an appellate lawyer won Ron a last-minute appeal, and the case landed in the able hands of an old friend.
Out of the blue one day, Mark Barrett calls me up and he says, "Hey, Greg, you'll never guess whose case I just caught." And I said, "I give up, I can't guess who." He goes, "Ron Williamson."
Do you know anything about DNA, Ron?
Nothing.
I was sure that Ron was innocent. DNA evidence established that Ron could not have committed the murder. I filed a motion to dismiss.
Mr. Williamson, would you please rise?
I had hopes that I'd get out. It was very emotional.
Mr. Williamson, you're free to go.
It was a good feeling to hear that judge say that I was dismissed from charges and free to go.
Ron! Hello here. Hello, Greg. Boy, you look different, buddy.
I believe that this was a miracle that I got off death row, because 0.1% are all the people that make it off of death row.
I mean, miracles do happen, and this is in this modern age, you don't really expect it, but if you're in an extreme situation, sometimes you can get relief only by divine intervention or a miracle.
God, in his infinite wisdom, put those two men close together.
The chances against both Greg and Ron being neighbors on death row, being close friends, and both being exonerated, the odds against that happening are astronomical.
Perhaps the greatest miracle of all is that Greg and Ron can look back at their years on death row without bitterness.
At the time I was arrested and the time I was convicted, I've been an advocate and a proponent of the death penalty all my life. I'm firmly convinced that this thing happened to me for a reason, and the reason is that people need to be educated about the death penalty, and I'm in a unique position, an informed position to be able to do that.
There are others down there that are like Greg and me, that I believe that are innocent.
Some people get off of death row, and if they're innocent, they should, but not many people bring their friends with them once they leave the row. And I feel lucky to have Ronnie as one of my dearest friends today.